In 1993, just 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the young Russian state stood on the brink of civil war. This was no exaggeration, no clickbait. The threat was real. President Boris Yeltsin and the parliament were locked in a true struggle for power. Their confrontation reached such intensity that it quickly turned violent. What is most surprising is how little this story is known, not only in the West but even in Russia itself and across the former Soviet republics. Yet it was in October 1993, under the sound of gunfire and on the barricades, that the Russia we know today was taking shape. Its birth did not begin with Putin. It began much earlier, and today I will tell you this story. This is Cold History, a channel where we uncover the facts and events that help us better understand the past and present, without distortions or propaganda. We could jump straight to the dramatic events of October 1993, but to understand why everything happened the way it did, we need to go back to the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union was living out its final years, and doing so in a rather poor state. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, known as perestroika, were meant to breathe new life into the country. In reality, they only sped up its collapse. Private business didn't exist in the Soviet Union. Every factory and plant was owned by the state and worked strictly according to a plan set by central authorities. They produced what the plan required and sold it at prices fixed by the government. In 1987, Gorbachev tried to change that. The new law on state enterprises allowed factories, in addition to fulfilling defense orders, to decide for themselves what to produce and sell. In theory, this was supposed to ease the chronic shortages that, by the late 80s, affected everything, from matches and laundry detergent to furniture and clothing. In practice, it didn't work out that way. The state kept control over wholesale prices, and those prices didn't even cover the cost of production. Nobody wanted to work at a loss, so factories simply stopped producing goods at government rates. Stockpiles were hidden for a rainy day, and store shelves emptied at alarming speed. In 1988, the situation shifted. Private business was legalized and entrepreneurs began opening cooperatives and small shops. Goods reappeared, but now they sold at market prices, often 10 times higher than before. Technically, things were available again, but buying a pack of pasta or a few sausages for a third of a month's salary was out of reach for most people. In this atmosphere of growing poverty and decay, the Soviet Union entered a new decade. In the spring of 1990, Lithuania became the first republic to declare independence. That started what was called the Parade of Sovereignties. One after another, republics began announcing their exit from the Union. Behind the talk of freedom and national revival, there was also a practical reason. Local party elites realized that independence meant full power in their own hands. Former communists became nationalists almost overnight, because that was the quickest way to secure authority without looking back at Moscow. These same sentiments were picked up by Boris Yeltsin, who in 1990 became head of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest part of the Union. His rivalry with Gorbachev, still president of the USSR, followed a simple rule: the worse things got, the better for Yeltsin. The weaker the center, the closer he was to full control. That's why he supported the republic's independence and even fueled nationalist feelings inside Russia itself. Tatarstan, Chechnya under Jokhar Dudayev, all of that was a direct result of his approach. Even though a nationwide referendum showed that more than 70% of voters wanted to preserve the Union, it all came to an end on December 8, 1991. On that day, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavezha Accords, formally dissolving the Soviet Union. On December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev announced his resignation on television, and the red flag of the USSR was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rose the Russian tricolor. It seemed like the long, difficult journey had finally reached its happy ending. Yeltsin now had power. The people had freedom and democracy. The economy was supposed to grow, and the country was expected to prosper. And to be fair, some of that really did happen. Strange as it may sound today, in the early 1990s, freedom and democracy in Russia were real. The media worked independently and openly criticized those in power, live, in prime time, on state TV channels. Censorship was gone, not just for newspapers and magazines, but for music, movies, and books as well. But everything else turned out to be much harder. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin became the leader of a newly independent country, but Russia was still living under the 1978 constitution, written back in Brezhnev's era. That meant the president's powers were limited, while most of the authority rested with the parliament. Yeltsin couldn't form a government, pass laws, or make key decisions without the deputies' approval. At first, that didn't seem like a big problem. Most of the top positions in parliament, and in the government overall, were held by his own allies, the same people who had fought by his side for reform and independence. Among them were three especially important figures. Alexander Rutskoy, a military officer and Afghan war veteran, elected alongside Yeltsin as vice president. Ruslan Khasbulatov, a lawyer and professor who had stood on the barricades with Yeltsin during the August 1991 coup and later became Speaker of Parliament. And finally, Yegor Gaidar, an economist appointed acting prime minister, responsible for launching Russia's economic reforms. By the end of the Soviet era, life for ordinary people had fallen to such a miserable level that it's hard to even find a proper comparison. Salaries went unpaid for months, and more often people were compensated not with money, but with whatever their factories produced. It was still manageable if the factory made vodka or cigarettes. You could always trade those for something useful. But imagine workers at a furniture plant being paid in door hinges or latches. People who just 5 years earlier had stable jobs, decent pay, and confidence in the future were now rapidly sinking into poverty, and many were losing their jobs altogether. Unemployment became another painful reality of that time. Soviet factories had spent decades operating inside a huge, rigid system of centralized supply and planned distribution. When that system collapsed along with the state, production came to a halt. One enterprise after another shut down, and hundreds of thousands of people who had been cogs in the machine suddenly found themselves out on the street. The new government under Yegor Gaidar set out to fix the situation. On January 2, 1992, it launched a series of reforms that went down in history as shock therapy. The goal was clear: a rapid transition from a planned economy to a market one. The reform began with what was called price liberalization. The state stopped controlling prices entirely, and they were left to the free market. The result came instantly. Within a week, the cost of everything skyrocketed by dozens of times, and whatever savings people had left turned to dust. By the end of 1992, inflation had reached an incredible 2,500%. Shock therapy also included lifting the state monopoly on foreign trade and launching a massive privatization campaign. That process was overseen by Anatoly Chubais, and to put it mildly, it was handled in a very peculiar way. It's important to understand that the idea of shock therapy wasn't invented by Gaidar or the Russian reformers. Similar programs had been carried out in other countries, and the logic behind them was straightforward. Living standards would drop sharply for a short time, but then the economy would rebound, bringing growth and prosperity. In Russia, though, The reforms were riddled with serious mistakes. Chubaisa's privatization, for instance, turned out to be extremely selective. The most profitable and strategically important enterprises were sold off to the right people, who became rich almost overnight, the very first Russian oligarchs. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens sank even deeper into poverty, and the promised recovery never came. That was the moment when a major split appeared within the country's leadership. On one side stood Yeltsin and Gaidar, on the other, Rutskoy and Khasbulatov. Both of them fiercely opposed Gaidar's policies, accusing him of wrecking the economy and even calling it economic genocide. They insisted on gradual, softer reforms instead of the drastic measures being taken. The conflict reached its peak in December 1992, when the parliament refused to confirm Gaidar as prime minister, rejecting the president's choice. Until then, he had only served in an acting capacity, so the refusal effectively meant his dismissal. To grasp the scale of that moment, the parliament had just removed a person directly chosen by the president. Today, that sounds almost unimaginable. It would be like the modern Russian parliament suddenly firing Medvedev while Putin could do nothing but shrug. So Yegor Gaidar was dismissed, but that didn't solve the country's growing economic crisis. On top of that, the standoff between Yeltsin and the parliament kept escalating, becoming sharper and more personal with every passing week. The main battlefield was the new constitution. Everything else, including the economy, had turned into a convenient excuse for both sides to attack each other, and eventually, it was Yeltsin who lost his patience first. On March 20th, Boris Yeltsin appeared on television with a national address where he announced that he was suspending the constitution. The move was shocking and completely unprecedented. He had no legal authority to do such a thing, and his real goal was clear: to derail the work on the new constitution, which was being drafted to preserve most of the parliament's powers. Just 3 days later, on March 23rd, the Constitutional Court, even before seeing any official decree, ruled Yeltsin's actions unconstitutional and stated that there were grounds for his removal from office. On March 28th, the parliament held a vote on impeachment. It seemed like this could be the moment true democracy would prove itself. A president who violated the Constitution would be forced to step down, and the confrontation would finally be over. But, as so often happens in Russian history, it fell just short of closure. The motion got 617 votes, 72 fewer than needed. Yeltsin survived, and the conflict only grew more intense. The day after the failed impeachment vote, Khasbulatov proposed holding a nationwide referendum, and Yeltsin's team agreed. The referendum was scheduled for April 25th, and it seemed like this would finally settle the conflict once and for all. The people themselves would decide whom they supported: Yeltsin or Rutskoy and Khasbulatov. 4 questions were put on the ballot. Do you trust the President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin? Do you approve of the social and economic policy carried out by the President and the government since 1992? Do you consider it necessary to hold early presidential elections? Do you consider it necessary to hold early elections for the people's deputies? Both Yeltsin and his opponents criticized how the questions were worded. They argued there should have been only 2, whether people trusted the president and whether they trusted the parliament. But regardless of the criticism, the vote went ahead on all 4. The results were as follows: 58% said they trusted Yeltsin, 53% supported his economic policy, 49% wanted early presidential elections, and 67% wanted early parliamentary elections. Naturally, both sides rushed to declare victory, but in reality, the referendum didn't resolve anything. The country was split almost right down the middle. It ended up being useful only as a snapshot of public sentiment, nothing more. In the middle of a deep political crisis, both sides had thrown all their energy into a vote that solved nothing, and maybe even made things worse. After the referendum, supporters of the parliament, especially those from communist factions, began taking to the streets with rallies and demonstrations. Their main slogan was, "Yeltsin must resign." But after the referendum, which, although inconclusive, still reflected the overall mood of the country, those slogans no longer sounded very convincing. The atmosphere was extremely tense. Everyone was waiting for the other side to make the first move, expecting provocation at any moment. Eventually, it all erupted into violent clashes with special forces, scenes of chaos and brutality that make today's protests look tame in comparison. The footage from that day still exists, but it's far too graphic for YouTube, so I can't show it here. The protesters weren't just passive observers either. They fought back, and at one point even rammed a police barricade with a hijacked bus. One officer was fatally injured. Many people on both sides were hurt, and for a moment it seemed like this had to be the breaking point, that the violence would force both sides to sit down and finally reach an agreement. But that wasn't the end. The key events of this story were still 6 long months ahead. In June 1993, a constitutional assembly was held, the last real attempt to adopt a new constitution for the country. As you might guess, the two sides disagreed on almost everything. Yeltsin pushed for a constitution that gave primary power to the presidency. Kaspulatov, on the other hand, proposed a version that largely mirrored the old Soviet model, where parliament held the dominant role. And, as you've probably guessed, that final attempt failed. No compromise was reached, and from that point on, the events that would define the rest of 1993 were set in motion. On September 21st, Yeltsin signed what would later become one of the most infamous documents in modern Russian history, Decree Number 1400, on the step-by-step constitutional reform. With this decree, he dissolved the parliament and the Congress of People's Deputies. The problem was that, under the constitution in force at the time, he had no legal right to do that. By any legal standard, in any country, such an act could only be described as a coup d'état. The Constitutional Court reached the same conclusion and immediately declared Yeltsin's decree unconstitutional. In response, the parliament moved to impeach him and voted to remove him from office. According to the law, the vice president automatically became acting head of state, and that meant Alexander Rutskoy stepped in as the new acting president of the Russian Federation. Formally, everything seemed to follow the law. The parliament did have the authority to take such action, but the problem was that removing a president required a complex legal process, an investigation, a constitutional court review, and a qualified majority vote. In reality, it was more a political move than a fully lawful one. So, by late September 1993, the country found itself in a surreal situation. There were now two opposing centers of power, each claiming to be the only legitimate government and accusing the other of staging a coup. The next day, the deputies gathered inside the White House to discuss the situation. Around the building, troops loyal to Yeltsin began to take up positions, while from the other side came crowds of civilians, both supporters of the president and defenders of the parliament. That same day, the barricaded deputies were cut off from the outside world. Their phone lines were disconnected, water and sewage shut off. Over the next 2 weeks, the country slid into what could only be called a small but very real civil war. Russia was split almost evenly in two. Each side claimed to be the only legitimate authority. Both the president and the parliament issued their own decrees, dismissed and appointed their own officials. For that short and chaotic time, two parallel Russias existed, each convinced that it alone represented the true power. The confrontation kept escalating. In clashes with the military and police, the first people were wounded and killed. I won't go into every detail of the timeline, otherwise this story would go on for hours. It's more important to focus on the overall picture and the sense of hysteria that gripped the entire country. There were, however, attempts to resolve the crisis peacefully. The head of the Constitutional Court proposed holding simultaneous elections for both the president and the parliament, a compromise that could have ended the standoff. But that same evening, his office phone lines and secure communications were cut off. Later that night, Yeltsin appeared on television and announced that he opposed holding joint elections and that there would be no compromise. On October 3rd, the confrontation reached its peak. Armed supporters of the parliament managed to seize Moscow's City Hall and then moved toward the Ostankino television center. Ostankino was guarded both by the police and by armed units loyal to Yeltsin. Soon, a real firefight broke out inside the building. Automatic rifles and grenade launchers roared. Grenades and improvised explosives went off. The attackers even brought in an armored personnel carrier they had captured earlier in the city. According to official reports, 46 people were killed near Ostankino, and more than 100 others were wounded by gunfire. By the evening, special forces from the Vityaz unit and troops from the Dzerzhinsky division arrived to support the defenders of the television center. The balance of power quickly shifted. Now it was clearly not in favor of the parliament's supporters. Working together, the military and special forces repelled the assault, and the insurgents were forced to retreat. In total, about 100 people were killed in the clashes on October 3rd, including bystanders and journalists. Later, Alexander Rutskoy admitted that ordering the assault on Ostankino had been a mistake. Nerves were on edge, he said. But regardless of the reasons, that moment became the point of no return. The remaining protesters took shelter inside the parliament building. At dawn on October 4th, tanks opened fire on the White House and the final assault began. The tank shells were more of a show of force. There was no real military need for them. By that time, the parliament had already lost. The footage of Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy leaving the building and stepping into a police van marked the end of the confrontation. Yeltsin had won. Soon after, a new constitution was adopted, one that cemented the dominant role of the president in Russia's political system. The country lived under that constitution until 2020, when new amendments were introduced, further expanding presidential power. The final human toll from the confrontation was 147 people, and you're probably thinking that Rutskoy, Khasbulatov, and the other leaders of the uprising paid dearly for the blood that was spilled, that they're still sitting in solitary cells somewhere, right? In reality, yes, they were arrested. A criminal case was opened for armed rebellion and the attempted overthrow of power. But just 5 months later, in February 1994, all of them were released under a general amnesty. Every single case was dropped. No one was held accountable. What's more, most of them later found their place in the new political system, and even built fairly successful political careers. As for the events themselves, they were never classified or officially banned in Russia. They were simply ignored. There were no TV programs, no interviews, no documentaries, no anniversaries, no investigations into the deaths of 147 Russian citizens on Russian soil. No official list of the dead was ever compiled. It was as if those days had been erased from the nation's memory. Only with the rise of the internet did people start to study and analyze those events. But for many Russians, for years, it was a story they never even knew had happened. And when it comes to how those events are judged, Opinions still differ, and usually reflect political leanings. Some say Yeltsin committed a necessary evil to prevent a return of communism. Others argue that the parliament was resisting a president who had lost control and was dragging the country into chaos. Whichever version you believe, one thing is beyond dispute. It was in October 1993 that the foundations of the modern Russian political system were laid. Modern Russia didn't begin with Putin. It was born to the sound of gunfire and flames in that autumn of 1993.
Прошу вас прекратить огонь в здании